Well, thank you, Eleonora. It's really nice to be here and talk to people who have similar interests to myself. So it's very exciting. Right. So yeah, the title of my talk is Neurocognitive Adaptations to Bilingual Experience. And I want to kind of start with just a reflection on bilingualism. Maybe most of the people who are here and also online, they might be very familiar with this, but just to set the scene, as maybe everybody knows, we have actually lots of languages in the world. So I found a source by the UNESCO who says that there's more than 8,000 languages that have been documented. And currently we have about 7,000 languages that are spoken across the world. And here on the map, you see kind of diversity or linguistic diversity around the world and how this differs across the globe. And you can see that North America and also England, which is very tiny. I'm not quite sure you see my cursor here. Looks quite not very diverse compared to if you go to Africa, for instance, or India. But nevertheless, we have bilingualism all across the world, or multilingualism. And there's an estimate that maybe a little bit more than 50% of the Earth population is actually multilingual or bilingual. Right. But what does it mean to be bilingual for an individual? So this is a quote by Charlemagne from a long, long time ago, who said, to have another language is to possess another soul. And I want to kind of pick up on that kind of quote because having another language doesn't just mean to be able to communicate in another language. It affects our thinking, it affects our brain, and it affects our identity. So exactly this kind of idea of that it affects our brain is something that I was very interested in the project that I'm going to present today. So this was a kind of a large project that I had with some collaborators in Birmingham, where we looked at how bilingual experience affects brain adaptation in both structural and functional sense, and how that might affect behavior in cognitive control. Okay, so here's an overview of my talk. I will start with kind of maybe reminding you, setting the scene of why we think that bilingualism affects the brain or leads to neural adaptations. And I will remind people, I'm sure it's a reminder of the bilingual advantage kind of question. And that brings me then to a model that we proposed a few years ago, which we call the UBET model. This is the Unifying Bilingual Experience Trajectory model. My collaborator, Ali Mazaheri, called it the UBET model. So I will explain that kind of briefly, actually, not in detail. And then I want to show you 3 studies that we kind of conducted on the basis of that model, where we try to test some of the predictions that come from that model. Right. Okay, so what's the kind of current idea about our current state of why we think that bilingualism, or how does bilingualism lead to brain adaptations? So the idea is that, or there's evidence that in a multilingual or bilingual speaker, the different languages are actually constantly active. It's not that one can completely shut off one of the languages unless that language is really not used and then kind of becomes very low level activated. And due to that situation, as a bilingual speaker, we have to manage these 2 languages and make sure that we actually use the right language at the right time. And this kind of control, which is often thought about as a suppression of the other language, is thought to have an effect on domain general control processes. So it's not just a control process that we use within the language domain, but it's mechanisms in the brain that we also use for other control. So that's the kind of background idea. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of bilingual advantage idea that arose about, maybe 20 years ago, that due to this kind of training and exercise of domain general control, we might see that if you have bilingual and monolingual participants doing a task, that the bilinguals are better at the task. They perform slightly better because they have this extra training of these control processes. In the meantime, people have kind of started to doubt this kind of idea because there's lots of people who can't replicate original findings of this bilingual advantage. And one of the reasons that this might be the case is that bilingualism has been thought about as a kind of too simple construct, namely as if all bilinguals are the same. But that's not the case. Bilinguals differ very much in terms of when they learned the language, under what context or situation they learned the language, how much they use the two languages, whether they code switch, so use the same languages in the same conversation, or whether they use one language in one context or with one person and the other language with another. So these different situations should affect our control mechanisms or our brains in different ways. So more recently, people think about the bilingual advantage, in quotes, in a different way, namely more think about how these different individual experience that people have, how they might affect the control processes. And that these factors are important to understand why we have inconsistent findings. So a few years ago, my collaborators and we kind of thought about, well, what we know at the moment, what is the state of the art of how the language or how being bilingual might affect the brain. And this model that we came up with is just a unifying model of other people's models. So it's not that we invented something particularly new, we just combined it into one model. The details are not so important here. What I just want to kind of point out is that at the bottom here, you see kind of different bilingual experience factors, something like diversity and intensity of L usage, or how much one switches between languages and in what way one switches, like code switching versus kind of really strict switching between two languages, or relative language proficiency between the two languages, and duration of the usage of a second language. And that has effects on the brain structure and the brain function, and then potentially also on cognition, so on the mechanisms in a kind of more kind of cognitive sense. Right, so in our project, we then kind of set us the task to look at how individual differences in bilingual experience might lead to brain adaptations that are predicted by our model, whether that's structural changes or functional changes, and how those then might affect how people perform in cognitive control tasks. So that's the kind of general framework. So in this project that I'm talking about today, we did two things, well, maybe more than two, but we run a structural MRI scan of our participants so that we know about the brain structure, both gray matter and white matter structure. And then we had the participants perform a few cognitive control tasks. And at the same time, we recorded EEG. So we looked at ERPs and TFR, so two different aspects of EEG. We also had a battery of questionnaires to learn about their language background, like the usage of their languages. And we did a few kind of more objective language measures. So measures of English in this sense because we had a variety of second languages or additional languages, so we couldn't test them on those languages, but we focused on English. And we had a general IQ test. We used the Ravens matrices for that. Okay, so everybody did several sessions in this study. Okay, so the three studies that I'm talking about will now kind of carve out different questions. The first study focused on whether bilingual experiences affect the structural or the brain structure, so leads to brain adaptations on the structural level. So in other words, if we go back to this schema here, we're talking about the first two kind of steps here. So this here is a diagram that shows the prediction from our UBET model. So the areas that we think that should be affected by language usage. And we also distinguished the areas and the white matter tracks in whether they should more be or should be more affected by something like executive control demands, which should be kind of based on level of intensity or diversity of the usage of the L2 or the language switching experiences of participants. And then we have another factor which we called efficiency, so kind of efficiency of processing, which we believe, or not just we, but which the field believes to be more related to the duration of bilingual language control. And so the areas marked in red are kind of predicted to be affected by intensity, diversity, and language switching, while the blue ones, and that's so these lines here in the model are white matter tracks. So that's the corpus callosum here in the front. Oops, where's my cursor? Here, corpus callosum, or the IFOF, and also the cerebellum, actually. Right, so these are the predictions from the model. For each of the study, we have slightly different number of participants. That was partly also due to the case that we were interrupted by the pandemic. So we started testing, and this, as I said, was a multi-session experiment. And a lot of participants, unfortunately, did part of the study, but not the other part. So we had to kind of almost start from scratch again once we were able to test again after the lockdown kind of was released slowly. So for the analysis that we're having here for the structural scans, we had about 150 participants that we scanned. And for the gray matter analysis, this kind of led to kind of 140. So we had a few people where there was too much noise and we couldn't include them, and 134 participants for the white matter analysis. And I also added here the information of to give you kind of a sense of what kind of participants these were. I added how one would have maybe traditionally categorized these participants. So even though there was a wide range of experiences, there were maybe roughly a third of these would be traditionally seen more as monolingual. That doesn't mean that they don't know any other language, but they have very minimal knowledge. And while our bilinguals, they were actually relatively high functioning bilinguals. So that was kind of a 2/3 of the participants. Everybody was right-handed to make it easier to interpret, and of course, no neurological or condition or any damage. Right, so how did we analyze our data? Well, first, we created our individual difference factors from all the questionnaires and all the other data that we collected on language ability. And we focused originally on 4 because these 4 factors were in the UBET model, but we actually reduced this later to 3 because we noticed that one of the factors was highly related to another one. So we ended up with so we ran a confirmative factor analysis, and we had then the 3 factors: duration of L2 usage, intensity, diversity of L2 usage, and language switching experience or frequency. So it's also a combined measure of questionnaire. And the original 4th factor, the relative language L1, L2 proficiency, we dropped from our analysis because that was too closely related actually to intensity diversity of language usage. And with these factors that we first kind of determined, we then predicted cortical and subcortical gray matter volumes of the areas that I showed you earlier in the diagram, and also white matter FA. We analyzed things or these data by using generalized additive models. So we didn't just assume linear relations, but with the generalized additive models, you can also predict nonlinear relations, and you will see that there's partly some kind of funny nonlinear relations we found. Right, so let's have a look at that. So these are the results for our intensity diversity of L usage factor. And as you can see, we had various areas, three areas that were significantly predicted, which are all in the right hemisphere. So some right inferior frontal gyrus and right middle frontal gyrus and the right angular gyrus. It's not so much maybe so important what these exactly are, and I'm not going to go into these detail, but one thing that might be useful to point out is that, for instance, the lower one here with the angular gyrus seems to be a linear relation. So these analyses also can pick up linear relations. While, for instance, this one here on the right, in the upper right, is almost like a U-shaped kind of curve. So saying that a very low intensity and diversity of a second language, which is probably monolinguals, they have a small gray matter volume in this right middle frontal gyrus, and then it kind of goes up quite a bit when the intensity and diversity goes up, but potentially, and I'm not sure how important actually that going down is, that dip. It might go down in the end again when there's a really high intensity and diversity of usage. Right, these are the results for our language switching factor. And here you can see that we actually have a kind of bilateral effects, and actually, interestingly, on very similar areas in the right and the left. So this is the, what is it, the left and right posterior middle temporal gyrus, and one here on the right, which is the, let me just check so that I don't see the wrong thing. This should be the right middle frontal gyrus. Okay. Again, these are U-shaped curves that we see here. So a U-shaped relationship with these factors. Duration of L2 usage didn't predict so much kind of cortical brain volume, but we found one effect on the left caudate, so which is also very much related to bilingual language usage, and again, a more kind of linear relationship. Duration together with intensity diversity also predicted some white matter tracks, and this is the left and right SLF. And interestingly, here's the wiggly lines that I was talking about, the kind of slightly strange kind of relationship, but significant relationship. And interestingly, right and left, very similar. Whether that's actually rather a U-shaped curve, and we just don't have enough data for that, isn't quite clear, but definitely some interesting results there. Right, so if we now compare what the areas that we predicted to be affected and the ones that we found, then we find that the predictions were largely kind of confirmed. Not all the areas, not all the tracks that we predicted were affected, but of course, this is even though a quite big sample in terms of what goes with MRI scanning data, but nevertheless, it's 150 people. It's people in the UK. It's a lot of kind of participants who kind of international students who are now immersed in the culture. So not so many kind of early bilingual speakers. So we don't catch all levels of possible bilingual diversity that there is in the world. But nevertheless, I think the results are still really nice in the sense that a lot of the predictions were turned out to be present in our data. Right, as I said, we find results that are largely confirming with the UBET predictions. And one thing that was interesting was that the intensity and diversity and the language switching factors were really more related with gray matter volume, and not so much with kind of gray matter volume of cortical structures, and not so much with subcortical and white matter structures. And that's something that was in a way also predicted. So the idea is that these kind of intensity, diversity, and the language switching factors, as I said earlier, they're more related to executive function control, and that's generally more associated with anterior cortical areas. While L2 usage has been more related to kind of efficiency, and that is kind of believed to be more related to subcortical areas and the white matter tracks. So that kind of fits with other people's ideas and predictions as well. Right, so that's the study about the structural adaptations. Now I will show you something about functional adaptations. And this particular study is focusing on attention or inhibitory control. Going back to this kind of slide, so what we're now talking about is just how brain function is affected by individual differences. And in this case, because we also have a task, we look at how then maybe these brain adaptations predict cognitive control behavior in a task or in two tasks. So here we have many more participants than in this structural study, because these were, well, participants that we added after the pandemic, because we had run some study with EEG before the pandemic, and then these people, we couldn't get them back. So we added more people so that we could scan them also in the scanner. So I think a quite impressive sample of 240 people doing EEG studies. Again, wide range of bilingual experience. And again, it's about 2/3 functional bilinguals and 2/3 kind of more kind of what we would traditionally think about as a monolingual. But again, we were not so much interested in the kind of bilingual monolingual comparison, but more kind of looking at how the different experiences affect performance and adaptations. So for this analysis, we looked at two tasks. We run a flunker task and assignment task, which is very typically run in this area of research. For the people who might not be so familiar with that. So in the flunker task, as you can see, people see rows of arrows on the screen, and they have to respond to the central arrow, and by pressing one or two buttons and basically indicate whether the central arrow points to the right or left. And as you can see, these flanking arrows, they are either pointing in the same direction, that these are congruent conditions, or in the opposite directions. And as you can imagine, it's more difficult to respond to an error where the flankers go in the wrong direction. So people are slower and make more errors. And what we're going to look at is the difference between the two conditions, so the so-called flanker effect or inhibition effect. Assignment task is slightly different, but it's also supposed to be measuring mainly inhibitor control. In that task, people need to respond to the color of squares that appear on the screen. And these squares, they appear either on the left or the right side of the screen. And that creates a conflict with response side where the button is. So basically, if the response side is on the same side as the presentation of the square, it's easier. And if it's on the opposite side, it actually creates a kind of conflict of response, and people become slower and it's more error prone. And again, what we're going to look at is the inhibition effect, so the difference between the two conditions. Right. This is just a summary slide to say we find the usual effects that we would expect in this task. We find an effect on RTs, on response times. We find an effect on ERPs, which is N2 and P3 components. It's not so super important to understand exactly the components that we're looking at. It's more about kind of a check that it looks all fine. On the TFRs, we looked at theta and alpha and beta, and we found the usual effects there as well. More interesting is now where we look at how individual differences in bilingual control or bilingual experience kind of affect what we see. So again, we have our three factors: duration of bilingual usage, language switching, intensity, diversity, that were used to predict, well, EEG components, so ERP effects and TFR effects, and then that predicting the behavior, the inhibition effect or interference effect. And we did analyze that by running a structural equation model. And the model looked like this. It's quite complex, and it's the result for the flunker task. And because this is too complex, I kind of created a simpler version that's more easy to understand, or easier to understand. So on the top, you see the individual difference factors in red. So our duration of bilingual usage, which we found to be negatively related with our evoked activity P3 amplitudes and P3 latencies, while the other two factors, language switching and intensity, diversity of bilingual language use, was negatively related to our induced activity, so theta. So this negative relations is quite interesting because it says that the longer people used a second language, or the more intense they used it, or the more they switch, the smaller the EEG effects, not the bigger, but the smaller the EEG effects. And since these effects are kind of believed to be reflections of anterior control processes, it looks as if bilinguals use these anterior control processes less, and that fits with some idea of that in a kind of highly proficient bilingual, they're not actually using their control processes so much, the frontal ones, they're using more posterior and subcortical processes. Another thing is also interesting, and that's kind of on the lower end of my diagram here. That's why I did it in color here. Interestingly, these different EEG responses, and for that matter, also the different individual factors, have opposite effects on the interference effect of the flunker task. So it's not that language duration of language usage has the same effect as language switching or diversity. It actually has opposite effects in the sense that a longer duration of language use actually made the participants worse in the task. And that's interesting because people have found that, well, and also we didn't actually find that the bilinguals were better than the monolinguals when we analyzed it that way. It can cancel each other out and can explain this inconsistency in the literature. These are results for the Simon task. They were a little bit less kind of exciting in a way, because we didn't find that the background measures affected or predicted any of the EEG measures, and also the EEG measures didn't predict our outcome measure of the, sorry, that's not the flunker effect, that would be the Simon effect. By itself still interesting, but maybe less exciting. But anyway, so as a result, what we can see so far is that, well, our two measures of duration of L2 usage and language switching and intensity diversity, they do affect our EEG measures, so our functional measures, functional adaptations. So we see functional adaptations and different ones. That's also interesting. It's not the same. And there seemed to be some evidence for this. I was saying that about this shift from anterior to posterior, more central processes. So we don't see this high reflection of kind of anterior control anymore when people have been using their languages for longer and more intensely. One other thing that's quite interesting is that we have these opposite effects of these different factors. And as I said, that might explain why the literature of the bilingual performance advantage in these tasks is so messy, because it's not as simple as one might have thought, that just being more bilingual means you're better at it. That's not how it is. We're probably even here just scratching the surface of what's really going on. But we have a first indication that it's a very complex phenomenon, and also complex in the sense that, as I have on my next slide, the flunker and Simon task, even though they both have been used to make the same argument that there's a bilingual advantage because people have found it with both tasks in inhibitory control. But this kind of showed again that other people had found before that these tasks do not tap exactly into the same mechanism. They might be similar mechanism, but they will probably be slightly differently tapped into. So also meaning we have to be much more critical about that this task doesn't just measure what we think it measures. But at the moment we don't have better measures, and it has been called for better measures, but we don't have that yet. Right, so the last study is similar, but it doesn't look at inhibitory control or attentional control, but cognitive flexibility. So we're looking at switching control. So again, same idea, same kind of outlet here, or set of tasks. Slightly smaller set of participants, but still 200 participants with, again, wide range of bilingual experience, and again, kind of a quarter, this time it's a little more, no, it's about a third, kind of traditional functional monolinguals, and the others are functional bilinguals. So these are actually bilinguals, these are not multilingual, so we really picked people just with 2 languages, even though I'm not sure that it would make much of a difference, but we don't know yet. These are the 2 tasks that we looked at in this study. So also very common tasks in the literature, especially the first one, the color sheep task. So in the color sheep task, participants have to either respond to the shape or the color of a stimulus. So there's one stimulus down here. So this circle on a red background, and they're told by a cue that appears a little bit earlier what they're going to do on the next trial. So this is kind of alternating, not necessarily alternating, but changing all the time. So they either see a rainbow like this, where they have to respond to the color, or they see kind of shapes, and that tells them you have to respond to the shape. The number letter task is slightly different, but the same idea. There's kind of 2 rules. You either have to respond to, so maybe I need to start like this. So you see a combination of a number and a letter, and you have to either respond to the letter, saying whether it's a vowel or a consonant, or the number, whether it's even or odd. And the cue to tell you what to do is in the location, whether it's on the top or the lower end of the screen. And that's also indicated by a cue that appears earlier. So you can already prepare what you're going to do, similar to the other study, and not just when the stimulus appears. Right. Again, just to kind of sanity check, do we find the normal effects? Yes, we do. Switching takes longer than not switching, and we find also the usual ERP effects like N2, and that's a P3, not a P4, for the switching effect, and on the TFRs we see kind of effects on theta and beta, where switching has higher effects, and alpha, where switching has lower effects. Right, more interesting is now, again, our individual differences study, again, the same kind of approach. We have our same factors, and here you can see that we have less that predicts things, but nevertheless, we still have that the factors of language switching and intensity diversity affect negatively, again, just like before, affect our induced activity, so theta, alpha, and beta. But again, no effect on the responses. That's all what we found in this model. When we looked at the number letter task, it looks slightly different. So in this case, again, language switching and intensity diversity predicted something. But in this case, it actually predicted our evoked response to the N2 amplitude and the switch positivity. I think we need to look a little bit more into I don't give you the whole details here. I think so this hasn't been written up in the sense of we haven't published that yet. So there's still a little bit of room in looking into what's going on. I could explain why, but no, I'm not going to go into the details. Anyway, So that's what we found in these models. Again, not in predicting any behavior in the task. Right, to just kind of summarize that again from this study is, so we find again language switching and intensity diversity. This seems to be kind of something that's particularly kind of powerful in predicting things, at least in terms of functional at functional level. But in some case, well, in the color shade, it affects CFRs, switch effects in the number letter task. It predicts the ERP's effects. Nevertheless, it's again kind of interesting that it has a negative prediction. So it's again, the more intense you use your two languages, the smaller the effect. So that fits with what we've seen in the inhibition tasks as well. And again, fits with this idea that we might have a shift from anterior to posterior subcortical regions. And similar to the other study, we see task differences, strong task differences again. So suggesting that these tasks tap into different control processes. It's not the same. And I'm not sure that it has been pointed out before for these two tasks, which are actually more similar than, let's say, the flunker and the Simon task, if you think about what you need to do. Right. That already brings me to kind of generally a general kind of summary and a thought about what we found. So largely we find support for the UBET model and other models, not just ours, and the ideas that have been pointed out before, that bilingual individual differences affect our brain. It changes structure in different ways, depending on the factor. It changes function in different tasks, and maybe not so much control processes in the behaviorally at least. So this fits with kind of the literature that doesn't find effects on maybe between bilingual, it doesn't find differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. Right, 3 take-home messages, which is basically what I just said, I think. So individual differences in bilingual experience lead to these structural and functional adaptations. And they're, again and again, I pointed that out, they're in line with this idea of reduced engagement of anterior cognitive control processes in higher, well, I don't know how to say, not higher level bilingualism, but in more intense bilingualism. Don't lead necessarily to brain behavioral differences, and that could be, in our case, just the type of participants that we tested. Other people might find it because they test something else. I've actually found differences in the flunker task before, and we see that here as well. And one other thing that I want to kind of point out again that we've seen was that these factors can actually cancel each other out. So it seems to be kind of a complex phenomenon of kind of leading to behavioral to smaller effects or larger effects. And that there is probably nothing like the cognitive advantage that people have talked about for a long time, but less so recently. Not just because it's kind of questioned whether there's an advantage, but also just from the mechanism point of view, there isn't one advantage that people are better in one thing or whatever. It's much more complex. Yeah, that's my messages from what we found in our study, and some acknowledgements to some collaborators and the funding. And thank you for listening.